Okay, so let's take a look at the third mnemonic for research methods. This mnemonic is hide dice. And I use hide dice to help go over the different parts of an experiment. An experiment is the most precise of all the research methods, and with that precision comes some particular terminology, and so I sort of give it a specialized uh, mnemonic just for that. So the idea of hide dice. Why hide dice? Well, an experiment is not supposed to be a game of chance or a gamble. It's supposed to be the opposite of that. And so, dice are used in gambling and dice are used in games of chance. And so the idea is to hide the dice, to put away the dice, to make sure that the dice are not part of your experiment because you're not taking a chance. Okay, so if we look at the H sort of speaks to what I just mentioned there about the need for precision. An experiment is the only research method that seeks to formally establish a cause and effect relationship. Right? So you really don't do an experiment until you've already conducted an enormous amount of research on a topic or on a phenomenon ahead of time. And it's sort of the last stage in establishing the sort of legitimacy of a particular psychological phenomenon. So with that, when you write your hypothesis for an experiment, you write it as a if this happens, then this will occur statement. And so really, you should include that language and you should be cognizant of the need for that language if you're writing and designing an experiment or using the experimental method. You should also be cognizant that you should not use that type of language if you are not doing an experiment. We've talked about that a little bit with flawed studies. Okay, when you are doing an experiment, there are usually two different variables that you're seeking to really assess. The independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable that you're introducing to a situation. It's usually the variable that's listed with the if part of your hypothesis. The dependent variable is what it is that you think the results will be. The dependent variable is dependent upon the independent variable. So if we say, if we have usually drug studies are good examples of experiments. So we say, if you take, this particular antidepressant drug, then a patient will report a lower degree of depression, right? So the independent variable in that case would be this new antidepressant drug, and the dependent variable would be the patient's moods and the degree to which they experience those symptoms. Got to have an E in here, so I go back to ethics just as kind of another reminder. You always have to pay attention to ethics. The experimental method is no different than that. When we talk about the dice side of the hide dice, really, again, the most important thing to look at here are the groups and the groupings. An experimental method always must have a control group and an experimental group as a result. Sometimes you could have multiple control groups in some cases, which is fine. But you can also just have one. The groups become your basis of comparison in the experimental method. So that's what allows you to assess whether or not the independent variable has actually had that effect. There is something called the placebo effect. Sometimes just the thought that you're being treated for something can end up having an effect on the person's moods or behaviors or whatever it might be. So there is kind of this interesting mind over matter phenomenon where if you had some disorder or some illness and I gave you a Tic Tac and told you it was actually a medication that was going to change your symptoms, there is a percentage chance that you would actually improve in your symptoms. And so in drug studies, for example, and again, drug studies are the most common types of experiments done in psychology. They're not limited to just drug studies, but that's generally how experiments are done in psychology. The control group ends up getting a placebo drug, a drug that does not have the medication, or a pill, I guess, that does not have the medication, but the person believes that it does. And it's just to see, is it, what the control group allows you to do is to find out, is it actually the independent variable, or is it just the perception of the independent variable that is actually resulting in the change in behavior? Okay, so the experimental group is simply defined as they're the group that actually get the treatment, or to say more specifically, they're the group that actually gets the independent variable. The control group does not get the independent variable. And ideally, they would get some kind of either no variable at all, or some kind of neutral variable that can then be compared with the actual independent variable given to the experimental group. The D, of course, operational definitions, because it's a more precise type of method than any other. The operational definitions are that much more critical. Of course, they're critical to all studies and all methods, but they're particularly critical here, so we put that in with the dice. And then the I, you're really trying your best to isolate just the independent variable. Very hard to do. And so it's really important. This is always important, again, just like the operational definitions, but it's really important to be cognizant of and be checking for intervening and confounding variables when you're doing an experiment. Okay, so that's the experimental method in psychology. Remember, it's not a game of chance, so hide the dice, and you should be able to design a high-quality experiment. Okay.